Hey guys, I hope you are doing well today. It's been a while since I made a video for you guys, but there's a couple things I want to go over in looking at the death of a salesman. Usually I do kind of this really brief lecture at the beginning of Death of a Salesman, but I wanted to switch it up a little bit to have you to read most of it and then for us to look at it. This week, as you kind of watch this short video, you're going to have a chance to read Arthur Miller's essay on tragedy and the common person. So we're going to look at like Aristotle's views of tragedy and what tragedy is supposed to do and supposed to be. Last week you read a couple pages about from Aristotle from his Poetics on tragedy, and then I think you watched the video as well. But I wanted to give us kind of the bare nuts and bolts of what this looks like. So we're going to start off with this question. What do Mitt Romney, Hillary Clinton, Batman, Macbeth, Jay Gatsby, and Severus Snape all have in common? I'll give you guys a couple, pause the video, trying to answer this question to yourself. The thing that I think all of these people have in common is they're all kind of on one way or another kind of experience tragedy in their own way. And it's this idea that Aristotle gives us, kind of looking at these characters, we can identify some of this tragedy. And we're going to look at the components of what tragedy looks like. Aristotle is the bane of my existence, but he actually has some good stuff to say about tragedy. And we have some essential questions for us. I think the first big question for us is why are we sad when we read stories? Or maybe even a better question is, why do we choose to read stories that are sad? Why do we choose to read stories of people that get hurt, of tragic heroes? Why do we put ourselves through that? And I think it comes down to another question. Why do we like to watch YouTube videos of people that get hurt? And I think the reason why is because we like to think kind of on some level that at least it's them and it's not me. At least they're going through that suffering and it's not me. We don't get to experience it, but we get to live through that experience of watching it happen. And our second essential question is, what is the American dream, and is it possible to achieve that dream? Both kind of works that we have looked at in social distance learning are attempts to answer that question, attempts to find the American dream, and then looking at people that try to achieve that dream. Of course, Jay Gatsby didn't achieve that dream. He desperately tried to do it, and it didn't work out for him. And then Willy Loman is trying to achieve that dream as well. So we get our understanding of tragedy from Aristotle, from his book called Poetics. This is the first major criticism of literature. And he says that there's two views that we can look at. Either there's comedy or there's tragedy. And that's kind of it. Our reading of comedy, what Aristotle had to say, is kind of lost to history, but there is that sense of comedy that he does use to look at. And really, a comedy is a story where there's a rise in fortune of one person. There might be some kind of disaster at the beginning, and that kind of falls apart, but then everything is put back together at the end. Think of like any sitcom. There's trouble in a sitcom, and then by the end, everything's fine for the next episode. Usually there's some exaggeration, there's some lewd jokes, there's some people that might fall, there's some hyperbole, but really at the end, it's a happy ending. Think of Shakespeare. All of Shakespeare's comedies, they all end in marriage, and all the tragedies end in death. And this is where we get tragedy that Aristotle talks about. It features a hero, someone noble, someone good standing, that has a fall as a result of something inside of them, or as a result of fate, or the will of the gods, or culture, or whatever it is. So they're at the top at the beginning, and then something happens, and they fall from grace. They might learn something, they might not learn something at all. Usually there's a change from forgiveness to awareness of a bond of love or hate. So tragedy needs three things. It needs order of values implicit in the play, the nature of the character in the play, and then the nature of the conclusion. So let's look at those things. What do we mean by nature of values in the play? Well, Aristotle says that the play must be set in reality. He calls it mimesis, imitation, like to mimic something. And so he says that tragedy has to be close to real life, the way that life actually is. I think of like Breaking Bad as a great example of tragedy. It is as close to real life as possible, which means that the values in real life reflect what's happening on stage, and it has to be close to reality as much as possible. The language has to be close. The magnitude. If someone falls, in terms of like their position, well, then it should actually reflect the real world and what actually happens. This is supposed to reflect universal truth and real emotion. We're supposed to feel something for this, and that real emotion is purification, catharsis. We feel there's an emotion that's raised, and then in order to be purified, and we feel pity and fear. I asked you guys a couple times as you're looking at Willy Loman, what do you feel? Do you feel pity or do you feel fear for him? Pity that, oh my gosh, here's this man that has tried so hard to get this far, and then to kind of have everything fall out from under him. Granted, he makes some terrible choices. Or do you feel fear that we can feel that we could be Willy Loman, or that we could potentially, or our parents could potentially be Willy Loman? When we think about this purification, this catharsis, we don't really know what Aristotle means, whether it's a catharsis inside of the play or it's for the audience. We have no idea. But I think it could be both, that there's catharsis in the play. The emotion that's raised eventually is released like a steam valve with the characters on stage, or it's with the audience. They feel that emotion is raised and then it's purified for them. So we don't really know what he means by that, which is kind of cool, right? That here we have this ancient Greek is writing the very first criticism on literature, and we're meant to feel something. Someone somewhere between the interaction of the actors, the players on stage, and the audience, they're supposed to feel. Emotion is meaningful. We're supposed to feel. Next, we have the nature of the character. Now, this character is not totally good or totally bad, but somewhere in between. They're basically good and decent. They're trying to do the best they can with what they have. Oftentimes, the central character, is a person of nobility, a king, a prince, a leader of some kind. And because they're raised, their fall goes by so much more, which makes Gatsby, as a tragic hero, so much more meaningful, because he didn't come from nobility. He came from poor farmers, and he pulled himself up by his own bootstraps. But the interaction, the culture that he found himself in, didn't agree with him. And Willy Loman, he's not a president, he's not a king, but he is someone of good character that's basically good and decent. He works really hard. He tries to put food on the table, but he doesn't really create anything. And that like lack of creation, even though he's good with his hands, that's the irony of the story. Even though he's good with his hands, he doesn't create anything. And we get that fall, that pride that we have. Within this character, we have the harmatia, the flaw or error. And this could be a weakness, a moral blind spot, or an error that they make. But there's something that causes this great person to fall, the mistake, the harmatia. This is the thing that makes them fall. Maybe you've had a friend that is super smart. I mean, they're so smart and they're so able to do great things in school. But for some reason, that smartness, that ability that they have is also the thing that causes them to not be successful. That's that moral blind spot. I like to think of it as like your greatest strengths are also your greatest weaknesses. If you have an ability to be really organized to get things done, but you allow it to be unhealthy, then that organization, that type A personality, is going to hinder them from being successful. So we're looking for the harmatia and the flaw. Now, this word is really interesting because it has to do with archery. And so you can imagine that there's a archer, right? And they're shooting an arrow. And that harmatia, that word that's used in Greek, is to describe being off the right angle. So you're aiming towards this bullseye, but your harmatia, your flaw, your error, your moral blind spot is actually not allowing you to hit the mark. You're missing the mark, which is kind of cool. So this great character has that flaw. Next, we have the nature of conclusion. I think this is one of the most important things in looking at tragedy. Aristotle, when he writes about tragedy in his book Poetics, you can read it, it's free in the public domain. He responds to Oedipus Rex, this story about this king that has so much pride and so much hubris that it leads him to being to his own downfall and ultimately blinding himself and being cast out of the city. So when we think about the conclusion, we think about this plot. Where's the plot going, and what is it going to do that's going to show us this fall, this tragedy? Well, there's two things. There's a few things that that make us see this tragedy. The first is the reversal, the peripeteia. This is where we think the story is going to go in one way, and then it switches, and then it goes another way. This creates irony. This creates kind of what characters understand in the play versus what audiences know is what's going know what is going on in the play. It's dramatic irony, and this peripeteia reverses in one way, and it shows something. It shows the character falling, and then it shows like the adjustment, how the world is going to adjust. And then we get recognition, the anagnorisis. This is I think it's one of the most important pieces in tragedy because we experience this all the time. Now, if you're to look at this word, the middle of this word is G-N-O. This leads us to know, K-N-O-W. It also leads us to Gnosticism, to know something that's been hidden from us. And then we have our root, ana, norsis, so to know something before. So this word, to change from ignorance into awareness, we experience this all the time. This is like those deep life lessons of where we might look back 5 years from now, 4 years from now, 3 years from now, and we think, wow, if only I would have known this profound truth before I went through this experience, I would have been so much better, right? Going from ignorance into knowledge. The funny thing about knowing something is that once you know it, you can't unknow it. And so in tragedy, characters go through this knowledge. They go from ignorance, look at that shared root right there. They go from that ignorance into knowledge. They know something they didn't know before. In other words, they grow. They grow as people. So tragedy really is creating tragic heroes, showing the stories of how they fall in order for us to learn from them. Aristotle says that to participate in democracy, we have to know tragedy. We have to know the world around us. We have to know comedy. To be a part of the arts is to be a good citizen, is to vote. And even when ancient Greek plays were being performed, it was attached to civic responsibility and to civic duties. And then lastly, we get suffering. We get pathos. That reminds us of like rhetoric, right? To feel something, a destructive act. In tragedy, there is an act that is used to create empathy and sympathy, or maybe even apathy. Certainly get all those words from pathos, but there's this act, this suffering that these characters have to go through. These noble characters have to go through, and then for them to come out, hopefully on the other side. In Shakespeare, they all die. In Oedipus Rex, he blinds himself, and that painful act reinforces the irony and the peripeteia, the reversal within the play. What is the painful act that Gatsby experiences? Well, he gets shot in his pool, ironically, by the husband of the wife that his lover killed, right? There's all kinds of layers inside of that, and that's the painful act. Or think of Macbeth. Macbeth has this moment of suffering where he gets told that his wife has committed suicide. He kind of resigns himself that he's going to die, and he rushes into death. Or pick even, I don't want to spoilers, but pick the Breaking Bad. There's that act of suffering towards the end of the last season in the series. So we have that suffering, that painful act. So to answer our question at the beginning, why do we read sad stories? Well, we read these sad stories because we want to find that connection of, oh, maybe I can learn something from these noble heroes, where I don't want my pride to be my blind spot. I don't want my own intelligence to be my own blind spot, my creativity, my capacity for love. We read these stories because are almost warnings to us. They tell us what it looks like to be human. We go through these sufferings. Or maybe it's anger, right? That you have this passion, but that blind spot turns that passion into anger. And instead of controlling that passion, the anger controls us. So when we think about tragedy, this is why Aristotle wants us to read. This is why Aristotle kind of looks at this and he says that we can understand this. Um, Willy Loman is the tragic hero of the 20th century. This is why we're looking at this. He's this type of tragic hero. He's someone of common nobility that goes through his life attempting to get the things that are worthwhile. He makes bad investments. He buys things that don't last. He tries to buy his house. It takes him years and years and years to pay it off. That's us. That's we are kind of our lives fit inside of that tragic hero, and that's what Arthur Miller is attempting to say while writing this play: is that the common person is the tragic hero. They're stuck within this tragedy. So as you read his essay, Come Into Office Hours, we can go over it. It's kind of dense. There's some good stuff inside of it. But think about that. Think about this idea of success. We looked at the American dream last week. We looked at The Fallacy of Success yesterday, written by G.K. Chesterton. All of that fits within kind of this theme of tragedy, of kind of seeing these things fall apart. My friends, I hope you are doing well. This is our final week of doing distance learning. You're going to get your final soon, which is going to be pretty on point, I think, with what we've done in social distancing. I miss you guys. I miss seeing your faces. I look forward to seeing you guys very soon. As always, happy reading.